as they compose components together, will actually implicitly add in multiple script files. So really only send down the exact number of scripts that you need, removing the duplicates. And in doing so, you will improve the JavaScript performance because the browser won't have to parse and instantiate and in many cases, execute that code. Here's another example. And this is actually a real-world example that came from a customer about 3 months ago. They were having some performance problems with their site. And we went and looked. And you can see at the bottom of their page, they had included just about every JavaScript framework in the world. And when we were talking with them, it was kind of funny. They weren't even sure what frameworks they were using. They knew that they were using pieces for different frameworks for different pieces of their page. But in some cases, they didn't even know how the frameworks integrated together. Frameworks are incredibly powerful, but the best practice is to minimize the number of frameworks that you use, particularly on a page basis. And wherever possible, use the same framework for a particular pattern. So if you're using a framework for JSON, use that same framework so that you're only downloading one JSON parser. The next subsystem that I'd like to talk about is marshalling. And I put together a slide that shows kind of the concepts, some of the architectural concepts of Internet Explorer that'll help understand marshalling. If you think about the DOM, or the document object model, the DOM is actually part of what we refer to as Trident, or MS-HTML, which is the standard web platform that's used by Internet Explorer. The JavaScript engine is an external component. It lives in a separate DLL, and it's used by Trident itself. But when the JavaScript engine goes to talk with the DOM, it has to cross a boundary. And this boundary is what we refer to as marshalling. It kind of comes from the concept of COM marshalling, if any of you have C++ backgrounds. One of the analogies that we use on the team is that crossing this boundary is kind of like crossing a toll bridge. Each time you cross that toll bridge, it costs a little bit more money. And so you really want to minimize the number of trips that you have to take from one side of town to the other to save money or improve performance. The best practice is really to minimize the number of DOM interactions that you make from JavaScript. In this function, calculate sum, you'll see that 3 times I actually interact with the DOM. And all 3 times I call document.body.all. On the surface, this may look like 3 DOM interactions. But in actuality, it's 9 DOM interactions. And that's because I first call document. So I cross over to the DOM, and I get the document and bring it back to the script engine. I then have to call over to the DOM to get the body, bring it back to the script engine. And then finally, cross over the DOM to get all and bring it back. So this results in 9 lookups. The best practice is to cache those lookups locally whenever possible. So in this case, I have a variable elements, and I've cached that locally, and then I can reuse that later on inside of my function. And in doing so, I'm only performing 3 DOM lookups. Moving on to the DOM, which is on the other side of that marshalling tier. There's a couple of best practices that you can use to improve how you interact with the DOM, and specifically the APIs that you use in the DOM itself. The first best practice is built-in methods are always more efficient than trying to roll something yourself. In this case, I have the variable nodes, the nodes array, and I'm iterating through it. So I've gone up and I've gotten all the children of a particular node, and now I'm iterating through it myself. Instead of doing this, I could use a DOM API, such as next sibling, to iterate that collection. And in doing so, I minimize my calls to the DOM. Another best practice is to use the selectors API for efficient access to collections. How many of you are familiar with the selectors API that was added in Internet Explorer 8, or CSS selectors in general, the CSS selector syntax? What you can do is you can use the CSS selector syntax inside of your JavaScript to very efficiently go and bring back a collection of items that you can then work on. In this case, I'm calling document.querySelectorAll, and I'm bringing back all required elements. I can then work through that collection very, very efficiently. Then you can see that we're moving our way from networking all the way through the subsystems in the browser. And now we're at the formatting subsystem. The formatting subsystem is the first piece of really what we often refer to as the display pipeline, getting your content to the screen. We now have a well-constructed DOM, and we need to display that. And what formatting does is it takes your document, and it takes all your CSS styles, and it maps those together to figure out what the resulting format of your page should be. One of the best practices here, and again, this really seems like common sense, but you'd be surprised at how many properties on the web don't do this today, is to only send the required styles. This is a pattern that we see quite often, which is a single CSS file that contains all the CSS content for your site. And this is kind of funny how often I see this in these types of comments in the CSS, but they'll say, these are the styles for page 1, and these are the styles for page 2. The news websites that we looked at earlier, 4 of the 5 of those news websites don't follow this best practice and send down much more CSS than is needed. In fact, one of those news websites sends down about 5 times more CSS styles that can possibly be used in the page. The problem is that the browser doesn't know this. We actually have to evaluate all of these CSS rules so that we can end up with the resulting format. We have to evaluate all of those rules that are not actually used on the page. So really send down the minimal number. There are some great server-side post-processing tools that will help do that for you if you so choose. This process of applying selectors is extremely complex and in many cases extremely slow, and it happens a lot. There's some things that you can do in your CSS to improve the performance of this, and when possible we recommend that you use class or ID-based selectors over element selectors. We recommend that you make element selectors as simple as possible and use child or descendant selectors when able. Let's take a look at a couple of examples of that. So first, use class or ID selectors. Here we have a large chain of element selectors. And what the browser has to do in this scenario when it's trying to format your document is it has to look at every table. It then has to go see if that table has a table row. It then has to go look at the table cell inside that. And then an unordered list, and then a list item. And it has to map this for every table in your document. Instead, you could choose to say, you could use an ID selector. In this case, I have an ID on the table, so I can set it to my ID. And then the browser can quickly map that style to green. The same is also true for child selectors. The last 3 subsystems, so now that we have our document and it's fully formatted and we're ready to display it to the screen, we're going to go through 3 subsystems that are referred to as block building, layout, and then ultimately rendering, or rendering to the screen. I'm going to group these together from a best practices perspective. And the single best practice here, and one of the most important best practices that you'll hear today, is to batch visual changes. In this scenario, you'll see that I have some JavaScript, and I'm calling inner HTML on it to set my document to empty inside this element. I then build up the title and put it inside the element. I then build up the body and put it inside the element, and then build up the footer. In doing so, I actually have 7 inner HTML references. So I'm not following some of the best practices that we talked about earlier. But more importantly, I could end up with up to 3 visual changes. Each time I make a change, the browser is going to attempt to display that to the user as quickly as possible.